There we go. All right, so welcome to our talkback session for Shared Legacies. I'm Virginia Brissett Hershik. I'm with the Jewish Council of North Central Florida, and this event is being brought to the community by the Black Jewish Dialogue Group, known as The Group. And it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce our two featured speakers tonight. Dr. Sherry Rogers is a clinical psychologist and social activist whose work encompasses movie production, writing, educational programming, curriculum development, and public speaking. She is the president and founder of Spill the Honey, a Michigan-based organization committed to promoting human dignity, as well as advancing public knowledge of the Holocaust and the Civil Rights Movement. Through artistic programs, sponsored initiatives, and strategic partnerships, Spill the Honey advances cultural tolerance, draws attention to contemporary injustices, and encourages young people to become compassionate global citizens. Spill the Honey has sponsored many community events, bringing both Jewish and African-American community high schools and colleges together to work on an ongoing joint educational program. To date, over 3,000 students have been involved in Spill the Honey programs, and as ambassador of Spill the Honey, Dr. Rogers has been an active participant in reaching out to younger generations. Robin Washington is a journalist, filmmaker, and co-founder of the Alliance for Black Jews. His commentaries have appeared in scores of newspapers around the world, including the Jewish Press, as well as in books edited by Ishmael Reed and Charles Ogletree. A weekly show host for Wisconsin Public Radio and longtime GBH contributing reporter and producer, he has also appeared on NPR, BET, MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, and many other broadcast outlets. Mr. Washington grew up in a Chicago family of Black and Jewish civil rights activists, participating in sit-ins and protests when he was just 3 years old, events he recalls fondly as family outings. He has gone on to chronicle the movement in his acclaimed PBS documentary, You Don't Have to Ride Jim Crow, and also made history with likely the first TV interview with a little-known Harvard Law student named Barack Obama. So it is absolutely my pleasure to welcome both of you this evening. And we're going to get started with, if you could both give us a little bit about your background, other than the things that I mentioned in your bio, that brought you to this work. How did you come to do the work that you do? I know that's very broad, but we'll put that out there and see where it goes. So Sherry, do you want to start us off? Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you so much, and this is such an honor, and each panel brings something valuable and new, and we're really excited to be here. So my background is a little different. I was trained psychoanalytically at University of Detroit. I have my PhD from Detroit, and one of my teachers actually was one of Freud's last students, Dr. Richard Sturba. And so while I learned so much about the unconscious and how history really affects the present, it really wasn't until my sister became religious that I started studying the Torah a little bit and brought rabbis and learned from rabbis that I really learned how the Torah wasn't just a history book. It's a book also. I would say it's the longest book club book, but it's a book to really use to learn about our own, sort of gives us guidelines about how to deepen our own life. So it's a long story, but from that point, I went on a Federation mission to Israel, and I met an extraordinary Holocaust survivor who was a tour guide at Yad Vashem, and he basically was, showing us around the museum, but his personal story really touched me along with many of the women that were on this mission. And he talked about his mother, who on the last day that he would see her, gave him a cup of honey and said that it was b'shert, that he should survive, it was meant to be, and that he should have a sweet life. And the cup of honey broke, but he held on to his mother's wish that he should survive. So he inspired me to produce a movie about his life, and basically what I was learning from it is how he survived. Basically, was not to see life as not worth living, but he filled up his sort of his cup with love, and he became a messenger of inspired people to really learn about the Holocaust and to spread kindness in the world. So I founded my organization called Spill the Honey Foundation, which is basically about, building bridges and finding, and bringing compassion to the world. So how did this movie come about? I don't want to take up too much time because I want Robin to speak about his own life story, but I was in Detroit, and we have a wonderful museum here called the Charles Wright Museum. And there was a Stanford professor who was speaking on his book, What Would Martin Say? He was Dr. King's personal attorney and draft speech writer. And if you saw the movie, he's the one in the beginning of the movie who says that the lions don't tell their story, the hunter will get all the credit. And he made a personal, he had told Dr. King that he would remind the younger generation of the 24/7 commitment of the Jewish people to their struggle. So we became friends, and it was the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March. And we looked around, there wasn't really any films on this history. As much as people talk about this important coalition and the memories of this partnership, we all know the picture of Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King. Ironically enough, there really wasn't a movie showing all these partnerships in this particular way. So the 50th anniversary from the Selma to Montgomery March provided a really important anniversary where people who were still living all coalesced to Selma. And this is where we began filming in 2015.
Robin?
Okay. Well, as Sherry says, I too am delighted to be here and proud of you, shall I say, for hosting this event and watching this significant film, which I had nothing to do with. This is a Sherry production. I'll perhaps be adding to some of that as a point, filmmaker also. But as you said in my biography, I grew up in a family of Black and Jewish civil rights activists. My mother was Jewish and not Black. My father was Black and not Jewish. I say that because you can be both, and here I am. That would make me, by any definition of Judaism, Jewish, and that would make me, by any definition of Black, Black. If I'm not Black, Obama wasn't Black, and I don't know what everybody was screaming about. Okay, so that makes me 200%, and I'm not going to waver from my mathematics there. My mother was the one who was a bit more involved in the civil rights movement. My parents were, shall we say, in left-wing circles in the 1940s and 50s that brought them together. But my mother became an officer of Chicago Corps, Congress of Racial Equality, and of the NAACP in Chicago. And she did, in fact, take my brother and one brother, 3 years older, and me on sit-ins and marches when I was 3, 4, 5, 6 years old. I can remember them like yesterday. One weekend, we'd sit in at the Board of Education. Actually, it turned out that event that I remember quite well was a week long. It's probably the longest continuous sit-in in the civil rights movement. One reason you haven't heard as much about that is failure, not win. And secondly, it was right before the March on Washington, where our side definitely won. So for history, as the Lions are telling the story, the Lions will accentuate what we won, not so much what we didn't win. But I would maintain there's a lot you can learn from the losses. Nothing was ever a true loss. Campaign. And I'm particularly impressed, by the way, in Sherry's film that she has Reverend Anderson in Albany, because Albany also was a loss. And tangent to go on, but I urge you, if you don't know about the Albany movement, to study it. You learn an awful lot about it. So I grew up, you said, one of your questions, what brought me into it? This is my reality, always was my reality. Our main issue in Chicago at the time was fighting against de facto segregation in Chicago public schools. I cannot remember ever not knowing what de facto segregation was. Yes, at 3 years old. Now, that's probably impossible, but I don't have a memory of not knowing what that is. I may use a double negative. And again, this is what we did. The meetings for various organizations were in our living room. One group, Teachers for Integrated Schools, was founded in our living room. Out of that came the Coordinating Council of Community Organizations in Chicago. Out of that came King's Movement, that it brought King's Movement to Chicago. The leader of the Coordinating Council of Community Organizations, who was ordained, if you will, in the living room I grew up in, was Al Raby. He became Harold Washington's campaign manager when Harold Washington became the first Black mayor of Chicago. Harold Washington's Senate seat was later held by that skinny kid I knew at Harvard, and the rest, again, is history. So I am deeply ensconced in this. I grew up and became a journalist. That is my way of achieving a path to the beloved community. I certainly know about protests. I certainly know about activism and the work that goes behind it, and hopefully goes behind it before the protests happen. Sometimes you don't have to protest. But I felt that the best way I could accomplish change was in journalism, in particular mainstream journalism, places like WGBH in Boston or the Duluth News Tribune, where I was the editor of the paper. I'll make a quick aside to say there have been more Black congressmen in this country than there have been Black top editors of daily newspapers. So if you meet a congressman, you didn't quite have, or she didn't quite have the accomplishment that I had there. But on airs, but I'm just putting a perspective on it. Obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but I gravitated toward civil rights work in history, and stumbled upon a freedom ride that had taken place in 1947, way before, certainly before I was born. I'm 64. I was born in 1956. Certainly before our activities in the 60s that I remember so well. It was the half generation before my parents. And one by one, I met people who were involved in that ride. It was called the Journey of Reconciliation. You all know the name Bayard Rustin. He was the co-leader. George Hauser was the other co-leader. Bayard had passed away by the time I learned about this, but I met George and Jim Farmer, who you know from Congress of Racial Equality, who led Freedom Rides in 1961. I got to know them quite well, and I found the survivors of that 1947 ride, put them on a bus, had them relive their trip, filmed it, got it on PBS, and that's You Don't Have to Ride Jim Crow, which has led to a lot of civil rights history. It actually came out right after Eyes on the Prize. Those of you who are familiar with that series, if you aren't, you should be. I hope you will look at it. And it's sort of a bookend. It tells you the story before Eyes on the Prize, and happy to share it with you. So anyway, there's a bit about me and my upbringing, which sort of inevitably leads to journalism and inevitably leads back to civil rights. I sort of encapsulate all this by saying the three driving forces or influences in my life are journalism, Judaism, and justice.
So I want to back up for just a little bit. Before Shared Legacies, there was Spill the Honey, which has a lot to it. It's way more than just a film production company. In fact, that's just one small part of what Spill the Honey does. Sherry or Robin, could you tell us, share with the group sort of this, if you can, in the span of what this organization does? And if folks haven't checked out the website yet, it's very impressive. Lots of folks involved with this movement. And I think we can learn a lot from Spill the Honey here in Gainesville. So if you could share more about that.
Spill the Honey Foundation uses the arts to promote human dignity. So in terms of creativity, I think this is really the way the younger generation really is is learning about history and learning anyways. It's whether it's rap songs that we produced in M&M Studio, creative pieces of art, film. We have a newsletter out that all the college ambassadors basically look up history and in our shared legacies and look up important Black Jewish coalitions now and different important dates. The students create their own panels. So we've been doing work with Morehouse College and University of Michigan's Business School, and a lot of the students didn't know this history. So I think the best way for kids to get involved, or college kids, is let them do their own thing. So I remember the first time they did the panel, you know, they had like a meditation session on it, and I'm thinking, meditations? So I'm saying, you know, you've got to let them create their own way of learning this history, and it's been really exciting. It's been exciting because it's like they're uncovering a whole history that they didn't even, had no idea. So it's been really, really exciting.
Robin, do you want to add anything to that?
Oops. I'll do so by answering the question that was asked in the chat, which is how am I connected to the film? Sherry and I met like this in the, what was it, the Boston Jewish Film Festival. I was moderating on the same. And obviously we got talking a lot, and she asked me to be on her board. But the other thing was, or is, my stump speech, if you Google me, you put in Black Jews or whatever, is you will hear, I'm happy to say I'm not the only one saying this these days. Whenever I hear Blacks and Jews, I strongly urge people to understand and consider the two terms are not mutually exclusive. And it's great hearing those exact words that I've been saying for more than 30 years being said by other people who may not be Black or may not be Jewish or may not be either, or maybe both. And so it's very important, if you're talking about the shared legacies, that you have the intersection as well as the two different groups. And it's very important to understand the groups, whether you have a film or not, that you understand the intersection. And it's nothing new. Not just to say my brother and me, but you know, we can go back to colonial times and find Black Jews wandering around America. Their descendants are still here. There's a whole long history. Sherry could talk about how we may add some of that. But I will throw out, can you give me privilege to share my screen?
Oh, sure.
Okay. I am going to throw out one thing that I hope will be added in some form to the curriculum, if not the film itself. But I will ask you, who was the most, what should I say, Sherry, important, prominent, at the time he certainly was prominent, significant, how about that, Jewish figure in the civil rights movement? Who wants to take a crack at answering that?
Rabbi Rothschild.
Kippy.
Kippy Kaplan.
Kippy Kaplan.
Keep going.
Well, Harry Wachtel, or whatever his first name was.
Well, remember where what my question came off of, though.
In the civil rights movement.
That's
Wow.
right. Okay. All right. So do I have share privilege?
Abraham Joshua Heschel.
Marshall.
The answer is, there you go. Not me, although I was there. Not my friend Christine Stone King. She's neither Jewish nor Black. But Chuck McDew. And Charles McDew was the second chairman of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was, in fact, the first chairman was Marion Barry, later of Washington fame, or perhaps infame,
Infamy.
you want to look at it, right? But he was indeed a civil rights activist, but only for a few months was he chairman of SNCC, and Chuck McDew took over, immediately took it to Mississippi very early in an extremely dangerous time. He was Jewish. He was not born Jewish. He converted as a teenager. He went to a Black college. He grew up in Massillon, Ohio, far enough north that he didn't take any crap when he went south. and he started getting arrested for all kinds of things because he wanted to go to a movie. And he didn't want to put up with Southern sheriffs. And during this time, he was having a terrible time at South Carolina State University in Orangeburg, a black college, that he had promised he'd go because it was his father's alma mater, and he's promised his father 1 year. He's having all these arrests. His parents are getting all upset about him, and he's having a terrible time. And then suddenly the Greensboro sit-ins happen not far away, sparked the sit-in movement in the South. All the kids in Orangeburg say to him, "We want to have our own movement, and we want you to lead it because you don't take any crap." And he ends up leading a huge movement and becomes, as I said, one of the founders and the chairman of SNCC. And one particularly fun story, and I'll just give you this, is that he was in jail in Mississippi, which is not a pleasant thing at all. The sheriff and company had decided that Chuck and his friends were communists. And so they would actually put them on display to visiting people, white people. And as they're sitting in their cells, some kid comes up to Chuck McDew and says, "Say something in communist." And he says, "Kishmir and Tukas." So
Oh
I
my.
leave you with the most prominent, most significant, most important Jew in the civil rights movement. Yes, it was a trick question. Remember that trick, because I didn't say white Jew.
Mhm.
I think
And
some people might
that's
need
the
a
way-
translation of
that's-
that.
Pardon me?
I think some people might need a translation of that for
Be
on
my,
the
be my
Zoom.
guest. Come on, we may have delicate ears.
What Spill the Honey also plans on doing, we have 80 to 100 other hours that we have not used. So we are going to create, 5 to 10 to 15-minute segments that can augment the film, and anything that we didn't include in the film, we are going to add, and they can be added to a video curriculum that can be used to augment some of these important conversations and eventually get this in American history. And why Robin is so important, obvious, besides his own personal life and lived experience, is that he's also a filmmaker. And because our nonprofit is about using the arts, he fits in quite well in terms of the, his own creativity and his own writing skills, and him being a filmmaker. He understands the power of film and how film, especially in this day and age, is a powerful tool for education.
And one final note on Chuck McDew is he did pass away 2.5 years ago. So I am dedicated to having that question that I threw out to you be known, and that the answer be known to people, because there's really no reason that we all don't have him. And he was a fun guy, by the way, completely fun. I'm in Duluth, Minnesota, and he lived in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And we had a deal that he had actually left the country. He went to Scandinavia for several years. He could not take it anymore. But he did come back. And the reason he lived in Minnesota is he always wanted to be close to the border. Well, Duluth is on the way to Canada. And our deal was, if he ever was going to hightail it out, he had to pick me up.
So let's go back to shared legacies. And could you share about the filmmaking process, something that was unexpected or challenging, or things that were truly and deeply surprising? Sherry, this one's for you.
Well, challenging. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Hello, I'm in a Zoom call right now. Don't call, please. Call. Sorry about that. Challenging when you're making a film. It's so challenging. I made this pure out of passion and out of the fact that I realized the urgency of the now, and realizing, like Clarence said, that these people who really witnessed the history, that they could have their personal recollections, were in their 80s. And even somebody like Julian Bond, who was the younger of some of the more well-known civil rights leaders. I actually filmed his funeral, sadly. I mean, he passed away before even Congressman Lewis and Reverend C.T. Vivian. So, and when I interviewed Reverend C.T. Vivian about this history, he said, do you know that nobody has ever asked me about the Black Jewish Coalition and my perceptions of it, my witness of it. So it was quite extraordinary. So I feel, and Reverend Vivian might not be as well known as some of the other civil rights leaders, but he was a giant. I mean, such a humble man who was integral to the movement. So I think having his witness and his recollections was really an honor. And so when you ask me, it's surprising that as Jews, we all lift up around the world Dr. Martin Luther King. We lift up and we look at the picture and the photo of Rabbi Heschel and Martin Luther King and with such pride, but that there was almost a history that unless you were a scholar in this area or unless you went to the Heschel school or, the kids 40 and under, I don't think would have had any idea about this history. So I felt there was a sense of urgency to do this. But in doing this, it was hard to fundraise, and thank God, which was really amazing, is Sherry Frank, who was like Congressman John Lewis's soul sister. She really rolled up her sleeves and brought us to the temple, and Congressman John Lewis thought this was important. So he was actually at our fundraiser with Reverend C.T. Vivian, and she really brought, the film crew to some of these very extraordinary leaders like Ambassador Young and Mrs. Rothschild, and who's Rabbi Rothschild's wife, and just so many other folks. I mean, she was, she's a community organizer through and through in terms of once she makes up her mind to do something, she commits to it, and she was extraordinary. But, creating like how you're going to lay this story out, that wasn't simple. That takes time to sort of, germinate. I mean, it takes time to figure out, how are you going to best tell the story? In what way should you tell the story? And that really takes time. It takes, besides the research, but just sitting with it and resonating with how best, because when I met Clarence Jones, I thought, well, should it be from his perspective? I mean, he was Dr. King's attorney, draft speech writer. He had Dr. King living in his house. He understood how he thought. This could have been totally done from that perspective. And at one point, that's what I was thinking. Some people like documentaries when there's one or two people in it. They don't like to have so many people in it. From a production perspective, I didn't do it the correct way, having so many different people in it. But on the other hand, I think because people don't necessarily know this history, I've been getting comments like they can really feel how deep this was, and on all different levels. And so I think it sparked people from that perspective. The Holocaust. I don't think people had really understood how much the Holocaust as an event in history, even though it was 30 years before the Civil Rights Movement, they don't talk about Rabbi Heschel's sisters being murdered and his mother being murdered in Nazi Germany, and connecting that up to Rabbi Prince, who was trying to warn people about Nazi Germany, and connect many of the rabbis who were very sensitive to the Holocaust and how people remained silent, and therefore they couldn't remain silent. Or the students that were involved in CORE and SNCC, whose parents, or grandparents were in Nazi Germany, couldn't fight the Germans, but they could fight behind this cause. Or, so many different instances of how the Holocaust had an effect in terms of the Jewish participation. Or we have a woman, Alexis Scott, whose family was founded the newspaper in Atlanta, and her father was the photographer, the Black soldier at the concentration camps. And so that was extraordinary that she talks about in depth. That we'll have, that we'll have a 15-minute segment that we could only put a shorter segment in this film about how her father came home and told her that he had to put his camera down and what he saw and what he witnessed. And when he came home, he couldn't drink out of a fountain and had all these restrictions, and just the whole double V campaign. And just, there's just so many stories that sort of, connect how that history imprinted the psychological motivation of some of the folks that got involved in the civil rights movement.
Okay. How can we use this film as a platform from which to create a 21st century version of the Black Jewish Alliance that existed in the 50s and 60s? That might be a tough question, but that's a lot of what our organization is trying to achieve. And whatever words of wisdom that we could glean from you would be appreciated.
Well, I'll let Robin speak next, but this film is being used as a tool around the country. So for instance, last night, it was amazing. It was the third time that this film was in, I can't even think right now, I'm so tired. Let me think of what it was. What?
Connecticut, I think.
Connecticut, right. And a reverend actually kind of organized how the panel should be. And he did an extraordinary job, because instead of just having the panelists on, he had different film clips. He had Martin Luther King talking to the American Jewish Committee, but he had one of the NAACP, after, I don't know if he was the president or somebody at the very top level of the NAACP, come on and talk about the Spingard Awards, on how he actually said, our most prized award that we give to either, actors or social activists is named after Joel Spingard. So that part of it wasn't in the movie, but to have a present day NAACP activist talk about this history in the present tense just builds that type of connectivity. And then using this as a tool to sort of, bring other elements that weren't in the film to talk about, or just as a film to start talking about subjects that have relevance for today, whether it's, white supremacy issues or police reform or Black Lives Matter, or different issues that I think, are today's discussions. It's not getting the right to vote in terms of what it was in the 60s, but it's this global understanding that racism and anti-Semitism are still, there's a lot of work to do in this particular area. And the film gives a platform to talk about these issues.
So a question just came up in the chat that I want to go to, which is, are you planning on filming a documentary on the Black and Jewish relations during slavery and Reconstruction era? So I think that's an interesting time period. So.
Well, those are two entirely different time periods. So you would have to have at least two documentaries to do that. Secondly, I can't speak for Sherry, but I think I will, which is you learn after you do a documentary. I certainly can't speak for this, but I'm going to project, but I think it's like having a baby. It is not something that comes easy. And then, I thought after I did You Don't Have to Ride Jim Crow, which was my second major documentary, that I'm not sure what I thought. I was so tired and so spent from the thing. I certainly didn't think that 30 years later it would still be playing on PBS, and that there would be state markers that were erected to things that happened directly because of the program, and that I would be, living my life along the thing. So I don't know how many of these we have in us. That said, I just read, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here. Sherry's used to me doing it. A friend of mine just mentioned Mark Twain's Pudd'nhead Wilson. Okay. And like a good intellectual snob that I was raised to be, I didn't let on that I didn't know the book. And I just let it go by as, oh, yes, And then finally the guy says something about it, and I thought, well, I have to own up to this. So I read it this weekend. And I have been a defender, for lack of a better word, of Mark Twain still being taught in schools, of Huck Finn. There is a line at the end of Huck Finn that tells you everything you need to know about what white people thought of Black people at the time of slavery, which is when Huck shows up at Aunt Polly's house or whatever at the end, and he has to explain why he's there. He says, well, I was on a steamship. We didn't hear a steamship come in. Well, I got off early because an engine head broke. An engine head busted. Oh, goodness. Was anyone hurt? No. Killed and inward, though. Thank goodness no one was hurt.
Yeah.
Okay, does that give you an idea what white people thought of Black people at the time? Pudd'nhead Wilson is an entirely different story and is messed up. His racial attitudes are completely whacked. I don't think Twain had thought it out completely. He wrote it as a serialization, and he was in money trouble at the time. And I'm speculating that he had to hurry up and write chapters without knowing the arc of the show. The reason I bring that up is it actually speaks of the Reconstruction time, even though it took place during slavery. But it's just some very high level, not 101 stuff. So I'm sort of revising my opinion on Twain. It absolutely needs to be out there, but it's not something you just jump into. And I would say, in answer to the question, the areas you're talking about absolutely need to be out there. At this point, if somebody wants to make it, I think that's fantastic. Go right ahead. Obviously, you have to answer the notion of Jews as slave owners. Go right ahead, answer it. You have to address the Nation of Islam's book, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews. I was there when it came out. I was the editor of a Black newspaper. Our publisher was a great friend of the local Nation of Islam mosque. So I can speak a lot about that. I can tell you the history they got wrong. I can tell you what they're quoting and all kinds of stuff. The biggest word I would use to all of this is context. And that's what you have to do with all this history. You know, if Cherry had made this film 20 years ago, it would not have been the same as right now. And I want to go back to an earlier thing. I certainly can't speak to it because I wasn't there when she was shooting this. Although, as again, a filmmaker, I can appreciate hours and hours and hours of footage, and you decide what to use. But what impressed me about it was Clarence Jones. As a historian, civil rights movement, I knew who he was. And I know there have been very few portrayals of Clarence Jones, C.T. Vivian. But what got me more than anything was the part, and I don't know, Sherry, if there's footage or somebody has some kind of media, at least a picture would be great, of Rabbi Heschel's birthday party where King is invited and there's a whole discussion of how that goes. Everybody has seen the picture of them with the little flags. Okay. It becomes a nerd, you know, it becomes cliche. And you say, oh, Blacks and Jews, King Heschel. All right, that encounter is actually them being themselves. It tells you more about this real relationship. And so for me, as a mean newspaper editor with my reporters going out, as a documentarian, the best stories are those where you don't know what you're going to get, where you don't know what will happen. And the worst are where a film crew or a reporter goes out and they come back and they report the editor's preconceived notions, right? So if I say, go out and cover that fire, and you come back and say, yeah, it's a fire on Main Street, and you know, they burnt down the kitchen, it was $200,000 lost. But if you told me, did you know that was Clarence Jones's house? And I didn't know that. In fact, I can think exactly, that happened in Boston. One of the great leaders of the Black community. That actually just happened a few years ago. Died horribly, he's age 90, in a house fire. He's a dear friend of mine. And the Boston Globe, where I've been on the editorial board, I love them dearly, sent the reporter out, said, man dies in house fire. Ken Guscott, that's not just man. We all have dignity and we're all important, but they didn't know who it was, you know? So Jerry has brought you something where we do know who these people are. We don't, we have a vehicle now to learn it. One last point I'll make on this, because the question I think was, what can we do? Having studied, lived and studied the civil rights movement and movements in general, it's very important to understand what a movement is and what it isn't. And so you guys are together. It's fantastic. Is it a movement? I don't know. It could become one. And it's important to recognize, are you a movement or are you a resource for other people to be inspired and carry on? There's a term, it's unfortunate, but it's the term that's used in historical circles called a movement halfway house. And Highlander Folk School, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, was a place that was interracial during the height of segregation in the hills of Tennessee, where Black and white could go and learn techniques for organizing. King went there, Rosa Parks went there. And so that was a movement halfway. It wasn't a movement itself, but it taught people who went on to do great things. So I throw that out to you to figure out what you are, where you want to go, the way of doing it, and how to convert people or attract people to your cause.
And speaking of that specific scene in the movie, I feel privileged because I interviewed Rabbi Gendler on his 90th birthday about 2 hours. I actually felt guilty because I drove up to Connecticut, and his daughter actually is the dean of Yale, and there was a big party there. And afterwards, I mean, he let me interview him for 2 hours because he was the one that interviewed Dr. Martin Luther King in front of the 1,000 rabbis a week before he was murdered. So I have that whole interview, and it's pretty extraordinary because Rabbi Gendler is, really sharp, and he has a very clear memory. It's pretty important that we have that documented.
So there are a couple of questions in the chat, but before we go to those, I want to ask another one of the questions from the steering committee, which I think is extremely relevant, which is, how is today's Black Lives Matter movement different, or is it, in parentheses, from the civil rights movement depicted in the film? How are things today different than they were in the time period that you tell about?
I think Robin can answer better, but what first comes to my mind really quickly is that there was a strategy that was designed, the nonviolent strategy, that took a lot of training. So even though some of the events, whether it was Birmingham or Albany, sort of happened based on the need of folks coming together, there was a strategy that was very specific that was in training. That's one. And two, there was a legislation that had to get done. Blacks couldn't vote. I mean, literally, they were treated, less than citizens. So there was a specific legislation that had to get done. But I do think it was also young people. It was, in that way, there was some similarity, but it was founded, it was a biblical movement. I mean, it was Reverend Anthony, Reverend C.T. Vivian, Reverend Martin Luther King, Rabbi Heschel, Rabbi Gendler. So even though there were lawyers that were, going back to the early 1900s, founders of the NAACP and all these different organizations, it was a strong biblical movement that binded that movement. Robin, do you want to say some more?
Well, the question of where are we today, and how does Black Lives Matter? How is it informed by the movement, or is it informed by the movement?
How is it different?
How is it different? Well, I wanted to take the positive approach.
Okay.
Well, is it different?
It's both. It's some of the young people I meet who are involved in it specifically say we don't want leaders. This is the way it's different. And the reason we don't want leaders is y'all had leaders, and look what happened to them. They took them out. We don't want that to happen again. But on the other hand, you do need names and people who someone can coalesce around. And Sherry just gave the key word. She says strategy. The most important thing to know about the civil rights movement is it was very, very strategic. There were patterns, there were rules, there were tactics is the other thing that you followed, and they weren't invented by King I'm privileged. I mean, one of the biggest humilities of my life is that the people who I met in the filming of my documentary, again, this was about the origins of CORE, the origins of the civil rights movement in the 40s, way before the movement had started. And the people who I met were actually and became my mentors, were King's mentors too, separated by 30 years or something, but I met them toward the end of their lives. They're all gone now. As Sherry pointed out, how she caught people at the nick of time. And I learned all the tactics and thought that went behind it. Again, my program is called You Don't Have to Ride Jim Crow. It's about the Freedom Ride of 1947. It happened because on June the 3rd, 1946, the Supreme Court of the United States actually ruled that segregation in interstate travel was unconstitutional. That was based on a case of a woman named Irene Morgan, who, just like Chuck McDew, I want you to know her name. In 1944, she was a Black woman who had gone from her home in Maryland to Virginia, her family home, and was returning Virginia to Maryland. She got on the back of the bus, or she got on and sat in the back. And as the bus filled up more, the driver said that even that was not good enough, and she needed to stand for the white people. And she refused. She was not nonviolent. She says that when the driver put his hands on her, that's when she kicked him. Obviously, I met her and interviewed her. As we played the interview over and over again, we realized with her spiked heels exactly where she kicked him. She was thrown off the bus, arrested, and Thurgood Marshall and Spotswood Robinson, another NAACP lawyer, took her case and argued it to the Supreme Court. And they won. They did not base it on the 14th Amendment. They based it on the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which has said that to have one state enforces segregation law on another would be an undue burden on commerce. They based it on a similar ruling at the time of Plessy v. Ferguson that it found that Louisiana could not enforce an integration law on a passenger going to Mississippi. So their logic was Virginia could not enforce a segregation law on a passenger going to Maryland, and they won. And so anyway, I could go on, as you can tell, on this forever. But the strategy, first of all, of that case, and not to make the civil rights argument, was hugely important. Second thing was the bus companies at first thought they had to abide by it, but the Southern governor said no way. And so on June the 3rd, the case was decided, and on June the 4th, travel in the South was the same as it was on June the 2nd. So a group of wild-eyed radicals who wore suits and fedoras and ties created the idea, invented the idea of a freedom ride, where whites would travel, whites and blacks would travel together. Two would sit up front, right behind the driver, one white, one black. Two would sit in back, one white, one black. Therefore, somebody was out of place, in both cases. And another guy would be on the bus somewhere, incognito, carrying the bail money. Is that strategic? And that's how they challenged Jim Crow. But did I tell you earlier about losses? They lost. The NAACP was not happy about what they were doing because they were not big on direct action. And secondly, they just won this case in the Irene Morgan decision. If they took the cases again, they had the chance of losing. And they didn't want to do that. So Thurgood Marshall wasn't happy about it. He claims to have lost the bus tickets needed for evidence. I highly doubt the crack legal team of the 20th century lost the evidence. So 3 of the riders spent 30 days on a chain gang as a reward for their action. But those same people, Bayard Rustin being one of them, took that knowledge directly to Montgomery and took it again in 1961, where that trip was recreated as the Freedom Rides that you now know. So I bring this all today to say we're not there yet. The young people and the leaders of young people. I used to be 3 years old doing this, right? But the young people and the leaders of Black Lives Movement are very inspiring, are very driven. They're less compromising than perhaps my parents' generation or even mine may have been. Have they all studied the history? Not completely. And so when I tell this to them, they light up. They realize, oh, there are ways to deal with this. Frankly, some of the generations in between have screwed up. And I love Jesse Jackson dearly, but I can tell you so many times he's called for a boycott. Well, the people weren't buying whatever it was that you're boycotting in the first place. So that doesn't work. You can't march in front of a building forever. Go back to the Freedom Ride. The problem was integration was not being enforced in interstate travel. So what did they do? They created a mechanism that directly put it out there, right? And that's what we need today.
Okay, a couple more questions. Did the transition from nonviolence, and this is from the chat, the transition from nonviolence to more aggressive tactics after Dr. King's death contribute to the change in attitude towards Jews?
Well, again, the film speaks a bit, and I'll let Sherry talk about that, of the how Black Power informs the Jewish movements at the time, or directly following. It wasn't so much the shift to, you had, what did I say earlier about context? You had several things going on at the same time. So you had Black empowerment happening, and you had, for lack of a better way of putting it, the shorthand of kicking the white people out of the civil rights movement, right? That, by the way, wasn't universally so. And one of the things you have to keep in mind is there's an asterisk to almost every period that, you know, the things are not as universal as they may have seemed. But in any case, the Black Power, advent of Black Power changes literally the complexion of the movement. But I wouldn't say necessarily it was the abandonment of nonviolence. Again, I can't stop talking about Chuck McDew. He points out something that goes back to the strategy I'm talking about. When SNCC was started, its founders, including him, envisioned it would last 5 years. They didn't see it as an organization that would last forever. The NAACP, by the way, has gone up and down and has some times that you wondered is going to be here. Some groups are no longer here. SNCC is no longer here today, but they didn't know that when it transitioned. And actually, it changed from Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to Student National Coordinating Committee, and that's where it dropped nonviolence. That happened at the same time as it was changing complexion, but I wouldn't say those were necessarily the same thing. And what was interesting was actually Chuck McDew's prediction coming true, that SNCC was ending really at that time. It didn't last after that. But Sherry can tell you, right, of how the Black Power movement influenced Jewish movements.
Mark Dollinger speaks to that if you read his book about how the Black Power movement influenced Jews becoming more, directing their energy towards Israel and Soviet Jewry. And there were many Jews who weren't as comfortable with putting their kippahs on before. Once Black Power movement came on, they were putting their kippahs on, and their own pride and their Jewish identity was empowered by the Black Power movement. So that was some of the positive, if you will, that came out of that movement.
Right, and I was thinking also the freedom rides for Soviet Jewry too.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. Charna, you have your hand up. Did you have a question, dear? Charna, did you know you had your hand up? Ask unmute. Charna, you're on mute.
I am?
There you are. Now you're not.
Oh,
Did you have a question, dear? You had your hand up, or did you just hit that button by mistake?
That was an accident. I don't know how to
Okay.
get rid of my hand. But,
Okay, no worries. I do have
but
one
I
more
am
question.
curious, I am curious to know if either Robin or Sherry are aware of efforts in around the country to teach the history of the civil rights movement to the generations that have missed out.
Well, we're hoping to build a curriculum around a video curriculum and a supportive curriculum on the subject matter because, you know, most people don't understand that the civil rights movement was, in a sense, the mother progenitor movement of a lot of other movements to come, including the women's movement, the gay rights movement. So we need to underscore how important this coalition building was that laid the foundation for later movements that empowered women and gay rights and other important rights.
Okay, thank you.
Marcia,
One other quick point on that too is for those of us who were there, we didn't think of it as history. We didn't think of it as, I mean, we certainly knew it was a movement and we certainly were looking for change. But when Eyes on the Prize first showed up in 1986, or when Taylor Branch wrote Parting the Waters, they weren't categorized, you know, there was no such curriculum as civil rights history. And I remember when the cause first came out, that someone said, hey, your mother's stuff, you know, somebody's putting all that together. And I thought, why? That's history. That's just a bunch of stories. That was our living room, you know. And but that's the way all history is. You don't realize it at the time.
That's why I'm so hopeful now that this film is being used to build bridges, you know, because right now I think the whole country is looking for ways to really work on racism. They realized when they just saw the lynching of George Floyd and we're all stuck in our homes with COVID. I think, you know, sometimes in life certain events happen where, you know, there creates a sea change. And I think we all are ready to learn, you know, more about what we can do to be allies to each other. There's been a rise in anti-Semitism at the same time. I mean, our students that I said we are working together on this newsletter around the country in college campuses, Jewish students are more afraid than they've ever been.
Marcia, did you have a question?
Yes, I just wanted to say that, of course, our public schools now are celebrating Black History Month. You know, I say that with a little, you know, sarcasm, but I also have had the opportunity to watch several Black themed movies. For instance, I don't know if anyone saw The Black Church on PBS this week. If you did not see it, I would really make an effort to go back and watch that. Also, I watched Selma and also Boycott, which was with Rosa Parks, and then with the movie Shared Legacies, I see all of these wonderful, wonderful people who are no longer here. And I had asked a question, who are the Kiki Kaplans and the Rabbi Rothschilds and the Ralph Abernathy's and the Martin Luther Kings of today? Who are the ones who are using these tactics with civil rights so that, you know, we have to keep reminding ourselves that, you know, racism is not gone, anti-Semitism is not gone. And, you know, we can't just become complacent and think that it's going to take care of itself.
Well, that's why we made this movie, so that we can remind people of the personal recollections. They can use the movie to build the bridges. And there are, you know, before Congressman Lewis passed away, our own Congresswoman here, Brenda Lawrence, created with Congressman Lewis a Black Jewish caucus that never existed in Congress. And the new twin win of Senator Ossoff and Senator Warnock really, I think, also brings this history to the present day. because when Senator Warnock got on CNN and he lifted up Rabbi Heschel and Dr. Martin Luther King, that was extraordinary because he didn't have to really talk about that history as part of what contributed to his own internal motivation to what helped him win this race and the importance of it. So I think we are at a point in history where this shared legacy, this shared recollection is really important. And whether it's the Urban League that has worked with the American Jewish Committee, whether it's the NAACP is going to be doing work with us on Shared Legacies Days. I think all over the United States, people are really looking to find ways to build bridges because they understand as we're moving into the future that coalitions are really needed. And I think people are sick and tired of this divisive climate. And we're looking to find ways of building common goals. And we realize even in our own families, we don't necessarily always agree on every single thing. But this template in history shows us that you don't have to be exactly alike. You can come completely from two different countries, but as long as you can share in certain empathy and find common goals, you can get things done.
Okay. So I think
Yeah, is that the end of the questions, Virginia?
we did have another question that I'm not sure has exactly been answered, which is what can be learned from the ongoing struggles of Black people currently? Like, I mean, we've talked about different aspects of the current situation, but what might be, the most important takeaway from what's currently happening?
Robin, do you want to hit that one?
Well, I mean, there's two. One is it's pretty obvious if you've been the least bit awake, and now we are woke, right? In the last 4 years, everything that Sherry just said about shared legacies and the legacy of today and the experiences today is not a luxury. This is not something that, it would be nice to say something against racism, or it would be nice to be an ally, or it'd be nice to be marching or something. Our lives are at stake. If you haven't figured that out, spend a little time with Proud Boys or watch the footage on January 6th again. And I think it makes it very clear what's at stake. So, we're not out of the woods by any means. And look, having studied history and the way human beings are, I am a bit afraid, not definitely of the other side, although at least I know what I'm fighting, but I'm afraid of what will happen if our side fractures. I can think back to when Carter was president. We're not making political statements one way or the other, but I can remember this great attack on him by the left because of whatever policy he had on Nicaragua. Well, what did you get from that? You got Ronald Reagan. Is that what you wanted? Well, Ronald Reagan today is a pussycat compared to what we had now. And so do I see stuff already, people criticizing Biden? Yep. My frustrations of, and I'm not just saying young people, but people who haven't studied tactics and strategies and everything, is nowhere near my frustration of people making serious mistakes like that again. Does that mean that everything that Biden does is wonderful and great? No. I said I grew up in my living room. It was a coalition. Everybody in there didn't like each other, but they were there for the same reason. My mother would serve lemonade at meetings of CORE or the NAACP. Why? Because if you wanted a beer, she said, get out of here and go to a bar. We're not here to get drunk. We're here in a battle. We're here in a movement. You can drink your lemonade if you want to drink something. You're thirsty. So, I don't want to leave on a negative note, but I do want to leave on a warning. And it's great to be looking for the young people and say, where are they? Where are they? Somebody will emerge. I'm not too worried about that. But I am worried that any of us become complacent. What we just went through happened once before in the last century. You know exactly what that was. As far as the Black community and Black empowerment, yes, it does mean buying black, but it also means teaching, and I don't mean it patronizingly, but economics, teaching the difference between wealth and income to large numbers of, frankly, all people, the unempowered, non-college graduate white people who are similar to those who stormed the Capitol need to learn about this. But certainly the Black community needs to have the mechanism of wealth in order to lift itself up. I just can't stress that enough.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Sherry, so much for your insights into this conversation. Yes, we have everyone do a little, there we go. We got some rounds of applause. Myrna, do you want to
Yes, I did wanted to thank all of you who signed up to watch this and contribute, especially Sherry and Robin. My thanks to you in presenting just a really fascinating, interesting look at all of the things that I think not only came up, at least for me, not only came up from watching Shared Legacies, but just in living in 2021, if you will. So my thanks to you all. I hope that this will be the beginning of additional dialogue with this group. I also want to thank Virginia for her diligence and hard work in making this happen. And I know that she had help from William Alford, so please thank him as well. And let's do this again. Thank you again so much, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Well, when we get the curriculum, you can invite us back because there's a lot more to learn, and hopefully this just sparked, a deeper interest and deepened your understanding, and there's a lot more to learn.
Well, that will be a beautiful thing, and I will look forward to it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yolanda, where are you? We're supposed to chat before
Thank
you
you.
go. I think she's gone already. Okay. Okay.
Thanks again. A pleasure.
You.
Oh, have a good night. Thank you so much. Okay.
Ms. Fowler.